turn this on, huh? Okay. Good afternoon. Everybody's quiet immediately. That's wonderful. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to the 2024 Holocaust Memorial Lecture here at Washington University in St. Louis. My name is Annika Walke. I'm a faculty member in the History Department, but I'm also currently the chair of the Holocaust Memorial Lecture Committee, which decides upon who we invite as a speaker and organizes this event and some other programming around the lecture, focusing primarily on interactions between the speaker and students. Before I say a few words about the lecture and introduce our speaker for tonight, I want to respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional ancestral lands of the Osage Nation, Missouri, and the Illini Confederacy, who were removed unjustly. We in this community are the beneficiaries of that removal. We pay respect to elders both present and past as we live, work, and study here at Washington University in St. Louis. The Holocaust Memorial Lecture is an annual event organized by the Holocaust Memorial Lecture Committee in collaboration with the Center for Humanities. Faculty members, graduate students, members of the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum, and the WashU Hillel serve on this committee, and I want to thank them all for their continued service. I also want to thank the staff of the Center for the Humanities for their support, especially Kathleen Fields and Alicia Dean, who provided essential support in organizing and advertising this event. And I also want to thank Braden Hense, who's somewhere out there, who's taking care of the technology tonight. The Office of the Chancellor, Dr. Andrew Martin, has supported this event since its inception, and I'm very grateful for the funding that the office provided for this year's event as well. The Washington University Holocaust Memorial Lecture was inaugurated in 1989 by then Chancellor William H. Danforth. At the request of both students and faculty, he appointed a committee to establish a permanent lecture that would commemorate the Holocaust and also educate the public about the broader implications of other instances of systematic persecution, mass murder, and genocide. This lecture is timely, and it is important at a time that anti-Semitism, racism, and homophobia are fueling increasingly radical and violent rhetoric in the media, in national and state capitals, in social media networks, and on the streets. It is relevant as warfare in Ukraine, the Middle East, and elsewhere drives millions of people into exile, displacement, and hunger, and is accompanied by eliminationist propaganda. Last week's election in the United States demonstrated an increasing willingness among the population to condone and support violence against immigrants and racialized groups, against women, against queer and transgender individuals, and against political opponents. The incoming president has gained a popular vote in favor of massive restrictions to the rights of large parts of the population. We must caution against using the Holocaust as a lesson. As Jean Amery, a philosopher and writer who survived torture and camp imprisonment at the hands of the Nazi regime, remarked, there is nothing to be learned from Auschwitz. And yet, educating ourselves about the dynamics and the danger of authoritarian politics, about genocidal rhetoric and massive violence, it is vital to our ability to identify and to counter them when and where they appear. Typically, the Holocaust Memorial Lecture here is held on or near November the 9th, specifically to commemorate the night of pogroms, or the so-called November pogrom in 1938 Germany. We consider and remember with that a moment in which National Socialist violence and German citizens' willingness to use violence escalated, and it set the stage for genocide and mass murder within just a few years. On November the 9th in 1938, members of the SA and the NSDAP, supported by a violent mob of civilians, destroyed hundreds of synagogues and Jewish community buildings, hospitals, and schools. They smashed windows, looted stores, broke into apartments, and vandalized the interior. They abused and violated residents and did not shy away from murder. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and imprisoned in concentration camps. That night was a turning point. The assault on Jews, their property, and their institutions surpassed all previous acts of harassment and violence against Jews. It was the beginning of the systematic use of physical violence, of imprisonment, and of murder. The pogrom was no longer aimed solely at discrimination and isolation of Jewish neighbors, but it was aimed at their expulsion from their homeland and the eradication of Jewish culture in Germany as a whole. Months later, in September 1939, the violence that until then had been used within Nazi Germany turned outward. The attack on the 1st of September 1939, which we now remember as the beginning of the Second World War, marked the intensification of efforts to reorganize the European continent and reshape its population at the hands of the Nazi regime. This Nazi vision was based on a combination of exploitation and extermination, the conquest of territories in Eastern Europe to exploit the land and its population, and on the physical annihilation of peoples and groups that were considered racially hostile or inferior. Invading first Polish, then Soviet territories set the stage for a genocide, or what we now call the Holocaust, the destruction of European Jewry, Jewish culture, and heritage. Whereas the German-occupied Soviet territories became the site of the so-called Einsatzgruppen killings, the occupied Polish territories provided the staging ground for extermination camps and killing centers such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Chelmno, or Majdanek. Hundreds of thousands of Jews from Poland, Western Europe, from Germany, and from Hungary and Greece were murdered there too. The mass murder of Polish Jews was implemented under the codename Operation Reinhard, a plan to kill the approximately 2 million Jews that had been moved to the so-called general government. As part of this plan, 3 killing centers were established: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, and these killing centers operated from 1942 through 1943. Treblinka would become the place where most Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto would be killed. Jews from other Polish districts, from the Bulgarian-occupied zone in Thrace and Macedonia, from Theresienstadt in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, from Germany, Austria, France, and Slovakia, as well as an undetermined number of Roma and prisoners of war were murdered there as well. With nearly 1 million victims, Treblinka was one of the main centers of the industrialized murder of European Jewry. In the fall of 1943, the camp was dismantled, all traces destroyed. Not quite all, as we will learn tonight. The site was camouflaged as a farm, with lupine flowers sown on the grounds. Visiting the site nowadays, one would see a large memorial placed there in the 1960s, and major parts of the ground covered with concrete, and a number of memorial stones that commemorate hundreds of Jewish communities that were exterminated in Treblinka. Most of what we know about the layout of the camp, the location of killing facilities and grave sites, is based on incomplete perpetrator documentation and the testimonies of very few survivors and local residents. For many years, important details were missing or poorly understood. This has changed, thanks to recent research on the site. Archaeological methods have revealed important information about the events on the site and the process of extermination that was conducted in Treblinka. I'm honored to welcome the person who took the lead on this research, Professor Caroline Sturdy-Colls, who will share tonight the results of her work and thus help us better understand just how mass murder on the scale of millions was possible. Professor Caroline Sturdy-Colls is a professor of Holocaust archaeology and genocide investigation, and she's also the director of the Center of Archaeology at the University of Huddersfield. Her expertise lies in the investigation of Holocaust landscapes and other sites of mass and interpersonal violence using forensic archaeological approaches. Since 2010, Professor Sturdy-Colls has conducted the first archaeological investigations at the Treblinka extermination and labor camps, and she recently completed her monograph, Finding Treblinka, which will be published by Cornell University in the next year, so please watch out for that. Professor Sturdy-Colls has also supervised projects at more than 60 other Holocaust sites. For instance, currently, she's the principal investigator on the project Travniki, Nexus of the Final Solution, a project that is funded by the Jewish Claims Conference. Caroline Sturdy-Colls is also supervising a postdoctoral research project regarding mass grave investigation in Ukraine, and she has a long-running collaborative project with the Lake District Holocaust Project. She's published extensively on the subject of Holocaust archaeology, forensic archaeology, and missing persons. Her notable and recent monographs include Holocaust Archaeologies, Approaches and Future Directions, the Handbook on Missing Persons, and last but not least, Adolf Island, the Nazi occupation of Alderney. Professor Sturdy Colls was a visiting fellow at the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in 2016, and also delivered the prestigious Joseph and Rebecca Meyerhoff annual lecture there. She was also awarded the European Archaeological Heritage Prize for her work in modern conflict archaeology, and I'm sure there will be others to follow. I'm enthusiastic about her presence here today, and I'm very much looking forward to the lecture. Please help me welcome Professor Sturdy Colls.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking everybody here at Washington University in St. Louis, particularly Dr. Valka, and also the Committee for the Holocaust Memorial Day Lecture for the invitation to be with you this evening. Okay. So to begin. In August 1944, Vasily Grossman, a military journalist and intendant in the Red Army, ran in an area of barren pastureland dotted with forests, situated approximately 50 miles northeast of Warsaw in Nazi-occupied Poland. As one of the first people to describe the landscape in which Treblinka and labor and extermination camps were housed, Grossman mused that many of the people who would ultimately die there, quote, may have had on occasion to travel this way before the war. Although seemingly innocuous, the geography and topography of this desolate landscape, as Grossman described it, were key factors in attracting the Nazi administration to this area. The concealment provided by the forest, the sandy geology, the good road and rail connections between the cities of Warsaw and Białystok would ultimately become central mechanisms in the perpetration of mass murder. The latter peaked with the construction of the infamous Treblinka extermination camp, which was later known as Treblinka II. And here, between 800,000 and 1 million people, most of whom were Jews, were murdered between the 23rd of July 1942 and November of 1943. And at this point, Jews were forced to assist with hiding the Nazi crimes of the murdered when the bodies of the victims were exhumed and cremated. Investigations that were carried out in the immediate aftermath of these atrocities, as well as research by historians, has ensured that the broad details of Treblinka II are known, albeit not necessarily amongst the general population. The mass transportation of Jews to the camp, the ways in which new arrivals were stripped of their personal belongings, the gassings that took place to ensure the killings were carried out on an unprecedented scale, and the mass burial and later cremation of the bodies of victims are, as I say, in broad terms at least, known. And more recently, my own archaeological investigations have located and interpreted the physical evidence of this camp. And in summary, this led to the discovery of the camp boundaries, many structures in the reception and administration camp areas, the old and new gas chamber buildings where most people were murdered within 15 to 20 minutes, and various killing sites within the camp terrain, including mass graves and ash disposal sites. I was also shocked the first time that I went to Treblinka to find objects on the surface, and during my fairly minimally invasive excavations to uncover hundreds of personal effects of the victims as well. Much of this work has been non-invasive in nature, and I'll explain more about the methodology shortly. But this is because Jewish law stipulates that bodies buried within mass graves shouldn't be disturbed. And so central to my research are the ethical considerations, providing respect to the victims whilst trying to find out more about this important landscape. And therefore, my excavations in the camp have been limited to mainly the structural areas. And this work has generated new spatial and material understandings of the processes of extermination within the death camp. But what this work has also shown is that the boundaries of the extermination camp do not define the geographical parameters in which atrocities were perpetrated at Treblinka. Indeed, the landscape features that I already mentioned, the forests, the roads, the railway lines, along with the quarry to which a single-track railway line led, were already of central importance as early as 1941. And it was at this time that a decision was created to build the very first camp in Treblinka, known as Treblinka I. And within a matter of months, that camp became a place where persecution and violence were commonplace and actively encouraged. And its status as a labour camp actually served to mask its dual function as a production site and a genocidal space. And so, drawing upon my recent historical and archaeological research, in my presentation today, I would like to discuss the evolution of mass violence and murder at Treblinka before, during, and after Operation Reinhard, which was part of the final solution to eradicate the Jewish population from Europe. I'll consider how geography and the deceptive narratives surrounding the labour camp were actually used to facilitate mass killings between 1941 and 1944, and explore some of the relationships that existed between the two camps and also the various killing sites that existed within the space. As well as considering the actions of the perpetrators and the experiences of the victims, I want to focus on the material traces of extermination, such as newly discovered mass graves and punishment sites. And ultimately, I'm going to argue that the systematic murder of Jews at Treblinka and their burial within the campscape began long before the notorious extermination camp was constructed, and continued outside of this camp even when that facility had been built. And as Annika mentioned, I should mention that a lot of this material in the presentation is derived from materials that will be published in my book, Finding Treblinka, which will be published by Cornell University Press next year. So the very first reference to a labour camp in Treblinka can actually be found in the state archives of the Russian Federation. And when interviewed by Soviet investigators in 1944, many witnesses reported that construction works in the area actually began as soon as the Germans invaded Poland, and that prisoners from Warsaw, Częstochowa, and other places began to arrive in September 1940. There were also rumours that German civilians had arrived to build barracks in the area in the same year. But in the absence of other sources, it's unclear whether there was a well-established camp at this time. However, it should be noted that the owner of the quarry that you can see behind me actually said that the camp existed sometime later. But certainly by the spring of 1941, Adolf Hitler's plan to invade the Soviet Union and thus bring about total war was becoming more of a reality. And so at this point, there were consistent efforts to strengthen the German-Soviet front along the River Bug, which exists near to Treblinka. And so therefore, there was an increased need for materials, for sand and for gravel to make cement. And so the existence of this quarry, very near this frontier in the village of Treblinka, actually offered the opportunity to acquire these materials that the Wehrmacht needed. And so at this point, Polish political prisoners from across the Sokoło-Węgrzów region were used as forced labour. And so a camp of sorts was created, at this point, again, still probably likely fairly ad hoc. But when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, the Wehrmacht soldiers that had overseen these labourers were actually moved and called to the Eastern Front. So a main captain, a Kreishauptmann of the nearby town of Sokołów-Podlaski, actually then formed his own concrete manufacturing company, expanded the operations at the quarry, and required an increased number of forced labourers to carry out this work, and therefore those labourers were sent to Treblinka. So then there was also a need then to fortify roads, railways, and then there was a need, because of the number of labourers being sent there, to build a permanent camp in the forest. And the first camp was known as a workers' educational camp, which was supposed to, in the Nazis' words, re-educate Poles to ensure their support for the Third Reich. We don't know much about this camp apart from the fact that it was very primitive, that its labourers there were forced to undertake very harsh work, but essentially the operations were expanded further, and so we can at least deem that this operation was successful. As an archaeologist and a historian, I'm very much interested in the history of the camp and what the physicality and materiality can reveal about experiences of those housed within it. So upon learning about these different phases of the camp, I very much began to look at early maps of the site, I looked at aerial photography, and then I undertook the first survey of the labour camp in 2012. And this and later archival research has really allowed me to build a very detailed picture of these different phases and the experiences of the victims. So it's possible to add here that this first camp, this workers' educational camp, likely existed just a few buildings, which we can see on this map here, existing buildings on the edge of the quarry. And it was known as Kosovsky Maidan. An increased number of labourers were sent to the workers' educational camp, and again, the number of barracks increased. But what we do know at this point in time is that the success of this initiative meant that the SS became interested in this area. And so on September the 1st, 1941, control of Treblinka was handed over to Theodor van Eupen. And the concrete manufacturing company continued to work there, but the camp was named der SS und Polizeiführer in District Warsaw, Arbeitslager Treblinka, SS and police leader in the Warsaw District Labour Camp Treblinka, later known as Treblinka 1 for short. And this camp would function under the control of the SS until late July 1944. And it's quite remarkable that actually Van Eupen remained in charge of this camp for that entire period, probably because of the crimes that he perpetrated so successfully in the eyes of the Nazi administration. And he was assisted by between 11 to 20 SS guards and around, say, 80 to 100 auxiliaries, so-called Travniki men, and prisoner capos to oversee the forced labourers. Like the workers' educational camp before it, Treblinka 1 labour camp was initially conceived as a place where Polish people who, quote, went against the prohibitions or ordered issued by the German authorities of the general government could be incarcerated and forced to undertake labour as punishment for perceived criminal activity. So this included non-Jews, but also a large number of Jewish prisoners who came from the surrounding region. And they were imprisoned for a whole range of reasons, ranging from illegally leaving their place of work, to illegal trading, to not delivering labour quotas. And around 20,000 people are actually thought to have passed through this labour camp under SS control, around at least half of whom died because of the conditions in which they found themselves, or because they were deliberately murdered, as we'll see shortly. Some of these inmates were arrested individually from surrounding towns and villages, but there were also a number of roundup actions that occurred, mainly against people who were suspected of resistance activities. So, for example, 88 people were taken from the nearby town of Rogów on the 9th of June 1943, and 105 people were brought from Prostin after the mayor was abducted. So many of these were retaliation actions for crimes that were perceived to have been committed by the Jewish and non-Jewish population. Technically, Christian Poles who were sent to the camp were supposed to have been told why they were being arrested and given a sentence. But actually, when we read the testimonies of these individuals, many were not given any adequate reason, and many were initially given a 3 to 6 month sentence, which was then extended by Van Eupen, and they continued to be incarcerated sometimes for many years. In the narratives of Treblinka today, if you go to Treblinka, many people don't even go to this labour camp site, which still exists. And if you do, the narrative that you will see there is that this was a camp for non-Jewish Poles. However, consistently, my research has shown that the larger demographic, almost at all times, was actually of Jewish individuals. And actually, post-war investigators, Soviet and Polish, who investigated the site between 1944 and 1946, said that this was actually one of the cells in the general action to destroy the Jewish population before, during, and after the extermination camp was built nearby. So Jews could be arrested and sent to this camp for additional offences, such as not wearing their armbands, having false identity papers, and Jews were more likely to be arrested and sent here, partly because, for example, they weren't allowed to trade. Jewish businesses were banned, so many people had to resort to illegal trading activity, But just being Jewish was an offence enough for people to be arrested and sent to Treblinka. So the number of individuals fluctuated, but on average there were around 1,000 Jews in the camp at any one time. And most of them were from Poland, but there were also German and Czech Jews in the camp at various points as well. Relatives of people who'd committed a crime and relatives of Jews could also be sent to the camp, and there were a small number of Roma and some Italian soldiers who refused to obey the Germans were also sent there. And there were men and women in the camp undertaking various forms of work. The camp inmates were forced to carry out labour throughout the entire period of the camp's existence. Some of the Jews who were sent to the camp had specialist skills, and so they worked in workshops within the camp terrain. The vast majority of people, as I mentioned, worked in the quarry, on the nearby roads and railways, and consistently we can see that this work was incredibly harsh. They worked for 16 hours a day, digging, hauling materials, and this was always accompanied by beatings. Some labourers were thrown into the quarry or hung over the edge as a form of torture. And their work was usually overseen by Unterscharführer Schwarz, who was described by witnesses as someone who derived sadistic satisfaction from tormenting, torturing, and killing, usually with blunt instruments such as clubs, hammers, or a pickaxe. Other workers were undertaking domestic tasks in the camp, in the kitchens, the stable, and the laundry, or in the nearby Malivek farm, which was situated to the west of the labour camp. But these workers tended to be non-Jews, or as I mentioned, Jews with a particular skill set. And there were also workers, particularly non-Jewish women and a small number of men, who were tasked with sorting personal belongings, some which came from the newly arrived Treblinka 1 inmates and others from the Eastern Front. I should say here that the labour in this camp, like many labour camps, did serve a purpose for the Third Reich. Workers did work on, as I said, valuable construction projects, and the provision of materials to the Wehrmacht was important, but all of these workers were seen as expendable, with very few exceptions. When the workers' educational camp was transformed into the SS camp in the fall of 1941, obviously they needed a larger purpose-built facility. So it was only at this point, actually, that the camp was fenced. A gate was built with a sign with the words Arbeit macht frei, work will set you free. I've done a lot of work with there are relatively few of these, but the plans and sketches that were drawn by survivors. And I've tried to map survivor testimonies to time periods and look at the evolution of the camp in terms of its materiality and spatiality. So these are some of the plans that show the earlier phasing of the camp's existence. And in the very first phase, this map here shows you that you can see that there are two main areas in the camp. There's this area here, which was for the labourers themselves, and then the administration area where the SS and their auxiliary guards were also living. As time progressed, the camp was divided further, as we'll see shortly. And we know from August 1942, when more inmates were being sent to the camp, that there was more segregation by religion and perceived skill sets. A double barbed wire fence was built and more watchtowers, and security was generally increased. We know much more about this camp actually from 1943 onwards, and particularly in 1944, because at this point we start to have aerial imagery of the camp when it was in existence, as we see on the left, and also shortly after its demolition. And so aerial photographs are an incredibly important resource to archaeologists to enable us to determine how these sites looked and to understand the experiences within the space. And so actually many of the archaeological findings that I'll now describe, it's not always possible to determine which period of the camp that they were from. But where we have aerial photography, we can certainly say that they, for example, relate to this final phase And so my work between 2012 and 2017 really intended to come up with a plan of this camp for the first time that was accurate, because there wasn't actually a plan that existed that really showed what this site looked like, even though, ironically, it's better preserved than the extermination camp, and some of the foundations of the buildings can still be seen in the landscape today. I'll just add here a little note on kind of methodology. So I use, as I mentioned, a lot of non-invasive technology. And at Treblinka 1, one of the first things that, that my team and I did was to use GPS, very accurate GPS, the same as you have in your mobile phone, but just much more precise, and a method called total station survey. And we walked the landscape looking for structural remains, such as building foundations and vegetation change that might indicate the presence of buried remains. We looked for pathways and for any surface scatters of objects, and we recorded them all, and you can see the plan that we created here, which actually, if you think back to this aerial photo that I showed you, shows that actually many of these camp buildings still exhibited traces in the landscape. And this work was complemented by a range of other methods. So we used photogrammetry, which is a method of taking hundreds of photographs of landscapes, of objects or buildings, and stitching those images together to visualize them in 3 dimensions. So we were able to do this for the camp kitchen, for example, and cellar, which remained relatively intact in the camp. And we also utilized laser scanning technology as well on the ground to visualize these structures and look at their levels of conservation and in this case, dilapidation. We also undertook the first ever LiDAR survey, an airborne LiDAR survey at a Holocaust site at Treblinka in 2013. And I'll show you some more of the results of that shortly. But LiDAR essentially uses thousands of laser pulses emitted from a device mounted to an aircraft or a drone, and it allows you to create a 3D digital terrain model of the landscape. And what it does is it shows you subtle depressions in the landscape not visible to the naked eye. And that was particularly important when looking for mass graves, as I'll show you later on. And then looking beneath the ground, we used a range of techniques called geophysical survey. These are not X-ray methods, I should say. They don't show you exactly what exists beneath the ground, but they show you contrasts between the natural geology and things that have been created, man-made interventions in the landscape. And so we were able to look for buried building foundations, for traces of backfilled pits that may be consistent with mass graves, for example. And again, I'll show you the results shortly. But overall, I just wanted to point out that it's always a combination of methods that we need, and it's always about comparing that back to witness testimony, documents, archival sources in a very cyclical process of validating our results. And the result of that was that we created the very first plan of what Treblinka looked like, at least in its final phases, and we were able to identify traces of almost all of the structures and infrastructure within this camp in the landscape. And so what did this tell us about the experiences in this latter phase? Well, Treblinka 1 covered 17 hectares by the time that it was built. And actually, the camp was at its largest in 1943. Now, if you think back, I mentioned that on the 23rd of July, 1942, Treblinka 2, the extermination camp, started to receive trainloads of victims, up to 12,000 people every day, to be murdered in the gas chambers. And yet here we have a labour camp which was continually developed and continued to be used to incarcerate and murder people, even when that camp was operating. And I'll return to that point shortly. So security in this final phase was heightened even further. More watchtowers were installed, and the camp was divided into 3 main areas. So what we have here is, I'll go that way. What we have here is this area here, which was for Jewish inmates. We have this area here, which was for Polish men. This area for Polish women, and this is Nazi terminology. They use Polish to describe non-Jews. And then we have the administration area for the SS here. And whilst the prisoner area measured 297 metres by 142 metres and housed up to 2,000 people at any one time, 120 guards lived in an area that was 3 times its size. The inmates here lived in dark barracks with a central corridor, and Saul Cooperhan described how we slept in double-decker bunks made of raw wood. We did not even have a single sheet or piece of straw, and the bottom of each bunk held 13 men, the top level 12. It was clear that our bodies would soon be as broken as our hearts. And similarly, where inmates lived in this camp really did influence their chances of survival. So Simon Friedman, a Jew from Warsaw, stated that one of the 2 barracks where Jewish men lived was known as the death barrack. And if you ended up in this particular barrack, then you were likely to be murdered. And actually, some of the witnesses talk about this site and also the hospital in the camp as being vestibules to the crematorium, with reference to the extermination camp. But as we will see, many of these victims were not in fact sent there, but were killed in much more up-close and personal acts of violence. Other areas, such as the workshops, which were in the southern part of the camp, offered a better chance of survival, because if people could demonstrate that they had a skill set, they were more likely to survive. And I should say, when I first went to Treblinka, Treblinka 1, there were fairly primitive wooden signs on each of the buildings that were visible, indicating their former function. And so one of the first things I actually wanted to do was find out whether or not these were actually accurate. And in short, they were actually, in the prisoner area at least, entirely in the wrong places. And so one of the things that I noticed when I first looked at the aerial photographs of Treblinka, that there was actually one more barrack than was currently marked on the ground. And when we walked over the landscape, we saw an open area of grassland between 2 building foundations. And through a process of comparing maps and aerial imagery with Google Earth imagery, for example, we were able to identify that there should have been a building in this location. And this was the barrack for the sick and the barrack for Jewish women. And so we carried out ground penetrating radar, which was one of those geophysical survey methods that I mentioned. And within those results, we could see 2 rectangular features that were consistent with the foundations of these buildings. We don't know why this ended up being covered over and why the Germans seemingly went to greater efforts to destroy this building. But what it did is it actually changed the layout of our understanding of the entire site, because all of the signs were essentially one place removed from where they should have been. So after a rather difficult conversation with the museum at Treblinka, I agreed to install them a new outdoor exhibition at the site with new signage, thanks to some funding that we were able to acquire, to remark each one of the buildings. And those signs integrated the testimonies of the people who were in each one of those buildings as well, to ensure that people who walk that landscape are able to experience firsthand the words of the people who really lived and suffered terrible things in this space. And what became very clear was that the entire architecture of this camp was designed to humiliate victims. So, for example, Barbara Bednarska, one of the inmates of the camp, talks about how the latrines, which are all marked number 10 here, sorry, I've gone one too far, number 10 here, were all deliberately placed on the side of the camp where any of the women using the toilet, these were big open pits, could be seen by the SS who were in the living area. So the whole process was humiliating and really degrading for them. And there were other features within the camp that we were able to identify the locations of. So, for example, there was this so-called walk of death, or a cage, which was basically in the area between the SS and the prisoner part of the camp. And if prisoners committed a so-called, flouting of the camp rules, they would be placed within this area between the barbed wire. They would be left there for days without food, without water. And in some cases, they would be shot at by the SS guards who were living in the administration area. And this area was also used to display the bodies of people who were shot by the SS. And and the bodies were left there as a warning, essentially, for others not to commit crimes within the camp. Also, even seemingly innocuous things like wells became killing sites at Treblinka labour camp. So people were pushed into them, people jumped into them to try and escape the punishments that the SS were meted out, and then when they were convinced to come out of there, they were then shot, beaten, or killed in a whole host of awful ways. And in the very middle of the SS living area, there was in fact a punishment bunker, which existed here, right in the centre, where people were made to stand sometimes for days on end in tiny cells. So part of our work was also a process of measuring these structures. And here we can see that people barely had space to stand in this particular punishment bunker. And usually people would be taken from here if they survived this and shot in the forest. And what became very, very apparent about this camp is that the guards who oversaw Treblinka 1 saw killing as a sport. To them, it was a pleasurable pastime that they seemingly took great pride in, and which resulted in them implementing a wide range of torturous killing methods. So just to provide a few examples, Jadwiga Morgul-Fiege, for example, described how Camp Commandant van Eupen had a particular love of trampling people to death with his horse. And he often involved his 2 sons, who were 3 and 4 years old, in this process. He would put the boys on the horse, and then they would deliberately chase a column of workers to their barracks. And in many cases, he trampled and wounded them, and in many cases killed them, and anyone who survived, again, was shot in the forest. And the deputy commandant, Karl Preffy, had a particular desire to shoot the prisoners in a whole host of different ways. He organised executions, and he killed them at random whenever he felt inclined. And often he would shoot Jewish prisoners in the mouth, according to witness testimonies. He had a particular liking to hurting children in the camp, and there are numerous incredibly difficult to read accounts of where he murdered children. And he was often also accompanied by Untersturmführer Herbert Stumpf. And they basically said on a number of occasions that bullets shouldn't be wasted on Jewish children, and therefore beatings, particularly with axes, with cudgels and other implements, were really common in this camp. And I think part of the reason it took me so long to write my book about Treblinka was actually because I uncovered so much material about the labour camp, and the level of brutality that was carried out there makes these testimonies incredibly difficult to read and to digest, because the Jewish prisoners, the non-Jewish prisoners who suffered here, did not have a quick death in many cases, and suffered terribly on a daily basis. And there were also visual representations of these killings as well. So there are a number of sketches drawn by survivors which indicate where Preffy would shoot, for example, from the window of his barrack through the fence. In this case, this shows him killing a pregnant woman. And so this was a game to these guards. And they used the landscape of the camp and its materiality and its spatiality in order to facilitate killing at every available opportunity. And it's also very notable that violence against women was prevalent in this camp. And often there are accounts that the guards would take young Jewish women in the evening, that they would carry out sexual violence, and then they would kill the women in the morning. And again, many of these stories are just not told in the narrative of this site at all. And I should say, before I just move on to the nearby killing sites, that this is all, of course, in complete contrast to the way in which the perpetrators in the camp were living. So the SS area of the camp had lawns, alleyways, manicured areas, and the Germans, seemingly took great pride in making this part of the camp, pretty even, for want of a better word, planting plants and things. And this echoed what they later did in the extermination camp as well. They had a canteen, they had social events, and often there was interaction between the guards in the extermination camp and the labour camp. And there are accounts of the deputy camp commandant, for example, of the extermination camp coming to the labour camp to socialise because they had such a pleasant environment in the SS camp area of this particular labour area. There is so much more, of course, that I could say about Treblinka 1. And given its role in the murder of Jews and non-Jews for a period of 3 years. But I hope in this summary that I've shown you that this is a real part of Treblinka's history that isn't known, that it was a brutal landscape that existed long before and concurrent with the extermination camp. And even when there was a capacity for more systematic killing to be taking place at the extermination camp, the guards at Treblinka 1 still chose to kill in ways which were up close and personal. And one of the areas that they did this was in the forest to the south of this site, in an area that was, in fact, Treblinka's first cemetery. This is about 500 metres south of the labour camp, and here, victims of the labour camp who either died as a result of the ill treatment I've described or who were shot in the camp were buried from 1941 onwards. And again, to go back to the narrative of the labour camp, which is generally considered to be a site where non-Jews was killed. In fact, my research has shown that the first victim of Treblinka was probably a Jewish shoemaker named Moshe Puro, who was beheaded in December 1941 for requesting medical treatment. And he reportedly needed this medical treatment because he'd been locked in a shed with no food alongside 29 other Jewish professionals from Kosovlaski who'd been sent to the labour camp at the end of 1941. And in the first months of the labour camp's existence, 10 to 15 Jews were killed every day by the Germans and were buried in graves in this area. And at no time was there any seemingly segregation in terms of the burial of non-Jews in one area and the burial of Jews in another. And this presented an ethical challenge later when we tried to search to the graves, which I'll come back to. The victims who died didn't have any religious services. We haven't seen any evidence that the graves were marked in any way. The bodies of the victims were usually buried in mass graves. And therefore, the labour camp internees instantly became anonymous in death. Again, if you go there today, that is not the narrative that you will receive. And when the memorial was built in this area in the 1960s, crosses were erected on symbolic graves in this area. And again, the narrative suggests that this was a burial place of non-Jewish Polish people, predominantly. But this site actually was also an execution site as well as a burial place, again, of Jews, Christian Poles, and Roma. And many local witnesses who lived in this area reported that they heard shooting from 1941 onwards. So again, even before a more official labour camp was built. So I mean, there are many examples that I can give here, but essentially, these mass shootings resulted in victims being shot or pushed directly into mass graves. And there were bullet holes found by forensic investigators after the war on trees adjacent to mass graves, which confirmed that people were lined up, shot on the edge of the pit, and fell into those graves. And on many occasions, victims were forced to excavate them first. And what we know here is that just as in the labour camp, the SS and their accomplices regularly engaged in killing games at this execution site. And so, for example, Israel Simlich, who survived, said that guards would line up 3 men and kill them with 1 shot to save using 3 bullets. Hammers, axes, and other forms of torture were used as part of these executions. In some cases, the victims died instantly, but in others, they were buried alive here in mass graves. And survivor Max Levitt also reported how many Roma people were brought here, many of whom never saw the labour camp. They were just transported to this execution site and they were killed shortly thereafter. And thanks to the research of a very famous Holocaust historian, Jan Grabowski, I was alerted to the fact that actually many other killings took place in this forest area before, during, and after the extermination camp was built nearby. And potentially as early as January 1942, this so-called cemetery likely became a killing site for Jews, non-Jewish Poles, and Roma who had absolutely no contact whatsoever with the labour camp. They were just taken to this area of forest purely for the purpose of being executed by firing squad or beaten. And how they got there really depended on their religion, their perceived crime, and their age when they were deported. But essentially on the 15th of October 1941, a decree was made in the Warsaw Ghetto that really influenced Treblinka's future path. And what this decree said was that any Jew who was found outside the ghetto without a permit or who wasn't wearing an armband would be punished with a death penalty sentence. And supposedly this was to alleviate the pressure on the courts in Warsaw and the prisons in the Warsaw region. And ultimately, after a series of meetings, it was decided that these death penalty cases would be carried out at Treblinka. And although under 18-year-olds were supposed to be exempt from this policy, they too were sent to Treblinka and were never heard of again. So it is very likely that thousands of people were sent to this area of forest and that they were murdered and buried here. And as I say, that they had no contact with the labour camp. And I can give you just a few examples here before I say something about the archaeological discoveries. Many of these people came from the prisons in the Warsaw district, so 59 prisoners from the Genscher Street prison in February 1942, hundreds of young people in March 1942, and also there was a group of Jews from Berlin who came via the Warsaw Ghetto and then were sent and executed at this location as well. So we do have documentary sources to back this up. And when Soviet investigators arrived in this area, as I said, in August 1944, they found evidence of all of this, but it didn't make it into popular narratives. Much of this information has been locked away in archives in the former Soviet Union for decades. So they carried out excavations in this area of 3 graves, but they believed that there were 58 mass graves in this forest area alone. And just very briefly, some of the things that they found. In one grave, they found 105 bodies, which were clothed in winter attire and wearing footwear, which were likely buried in the winter of 1942 and 1943. So this is at the peak period when the extermination camp, when the gas chambers were operating in Treblinka, when the SS had the opportunity to send these individuals to be killed in the gas chambers, and they chose not to. They chose to shoot them in the forest instead. In the second grave, they found 97 bodies, and these were wearing only underwear, but on top of the bodies, there were lots of kitchen dishes, tableware, lots of personal effects. Now, had these people been sent to the labour camp first, they would have been stripped of these belongings. Had they been sent to the extermination camp first, the same applies. So there are many possibilities here. They could be Roma victims, who, as I mentioned, were sent directly to be killed with their personal belongings with them. They could be people who were originally intended to have been killed in the extermination camp. But at various points, despite the Nazis' efforts to the contrary, the extermination camp was in chaos. Too many train transports arrived. The gas chambers broke down. They couldn't handle the number of corpses. So my research has shown that, again, the labour camp, the execution site, becomes a secondary killing site when the extermination facility simply couldn't cope. And so it's possible that some of these victims could have been people originally intended for the gas chambers, but who were killed in the forest instead. And in the third grave, they found 103 people, 25 of whom were women, and they believe that these individuals were buried in July 1944 in the final liquidation action of the ghetto, of the labour camp. When the labour camp was liquidated, non-Jewish Poles were released, but around 500 to 700 Jews were marched down the pathway from the camp, which you can see here, and they were sent into the forest, and they were made to pull their trousers around their ankles and walk like that so that they couldn't run away. And so the Soviet investigators found that very thing in the mass graves that they investigated and reported on it. And what we can see here in the image behind us, again, is an aerial photograph. And so I really wanted, after reading all these testimonies, to understand more about this landscape and re-find these graves. Because actually, only 19 graves were subsequently marked after the war, even though the Soviets believed that there were 58 graves in the forest. And the Central Commission for Investigation of Nazi Crimes in Poland found around 41 graves. So over time, knowledge of all of this had been lost. And in the aerial imagery, you can see many of the things that archaeologists look for when searching for traces of graves. So areas of disturbed vegetation, for example, and differential vegetation growth, areas of soil that has been displaced from the graves. And this demonstrated a number of burial areas existed in this location, but actually only the areas marked A and B here had some graves marked in the current memorial landscape. All of the other areas were unmarked. And this is where the LiDAR came in. So this is the first scan of the site using LiDAR. And what you can see here is that this area is now covered in trees. And this makes it very, very difficult to see anything on the ground and anything from the air. But with one of the great advantages of LiDAR is that you can strip that vegetation away. And you can get a bare earth model which shows you depressions, areas of different vegetational growth, and indicators of where mass graves might be present. So my team and I mapped all of these different areas, and you can see here that the number of pits in this region far exceeded the number of marked burials. So the ones in blue are the ones that are currently marked. The three in green were the three mass graves that we investigated in 2013. And the areas in purple and blue and yellow are other potential burial sites, which we identified as a result of the aerial photo analysis, walkover survey, and geophysical survey in 2017. And in 2013, we were allowed by the Chief Rabbi of Poland to conduct some very minimally invasive excavations in the three areas of the three graves that are green here in this image. And the reason for this was because it was very, very difficult in this area to do the geophysical survey methods that we'd done at the extermination camp, that we did at the labour camp, because the tree density, the vegetation density was simply too great. And because we didn't really know whether the victims in these graves were Jewish or non-Jewish, or whether they more likely coexisted together, after extensive discussions with the Rabbinical Commission and the museum and local Christian authorities in the region, we decided that the compromise would be to strip away some of the surface detritus to see if we could see human remains present and cover them back over immediately if we confirmed that they were. And so in all three of those areas, we found human remains that were subject to blunt force trauma in many cases, that had evidently been, the individuals had been clearly beaten and subject in some cases to sharp force trauma. We found shoes, we found bullets, and this led to those three graves being subsequently marked. In 2017, we were able to do some ground-penetrating radar in three other areas, and those three graves were marked as well. But because we had to adhere to Jewish law, we didn't exhume the graves as we might do in other instances, so we weren't able to sort of determine exactly how many people were buried in these locations. But what was very clear was the total disregard for human life in the way that these remains were present and presented in the graves from the few remains that we did see. And finally, in 2019, the Institute of National Remembrance actually decided that they did want to do a full exhumation of one of the graves that was identified at the site, which existed on the car park, where people parked cars and buses if they visited the execution site. So in their eyes, these remains were under threat, and they decided to excavate the entire mass grave. And this resulted in around just over 40 individuals being recovered as a minimum from this grave. And again, these were remains that had been subject to a whole range of blunt force, sharp force, and projectile trauma. A number of the victims had been shot, but many of them exhibited, as I say, much other forms of interpersonal violence consistent with witness testimony. So I'm conscious of time, so I will wrap up relatively quickly now, but you can, of course, ask me any questions you'd like about the work. But I just wanted to reference the fact that all of this work went on, as I said at the beginning, in conjunction with the searches that we did at the extermination camp at Treblinka 2. And we saw many of the same patterns and trends at the extermination camp that we saw at the labour camp. And there's no doubt in my mind that the fact that the Nazis got away with murder at the labour camp and the execution site was what led them to build the extermination camp in the first place. Because the idea that there was this labour camp there, which sounds very, fairly innocent, where all these killings happened and no one noticed and no one stood up and said anything, meant that they could get away with murder in this place. And there was a relationship between these two camps throughout, both in terms of the interactions of the perpetrators, the exchange of prisoners, and many other ways. But what we also then see when the extermination camp is built is the same level of deceptive architecture, gas chambers modelled on bathhouses, concealment of a barrack used to hold prisoner belongings as a fake train station to convince people that they were being sent to the east to work, or that Treblinka extermination camp was in fact just another labour camp. And so for me, the archaeology has really revealed many of these relationships between these different elements of Treblinka's landscape, and has shown how the evolution of mass murder at Treblinka continued over a number of years. And again, the success of this was reflected in the fact that the labour camp stayed open until July 1944 and continued to be a place where executions happened long after the gas chambers had been demolished. And so I think this is really important, in our understanding of the Holocaust, to recognise that, yes, Treblinka was an industrialised killing site. It was a place where hundreds of thousands of people were murdered because the Nazis sought to create a perfected system of violence. But it was also a dysfunctional one, and oftentimes they had to revert back to these early forms of killing. And in many cases, the SS didn't want to divert from that. And through the material traces of these sites, we can understand more about the people who were sent there, whose narratives have often, and stories have often been suppressed for generations. And, for me, it wasn't that no evidence existed at Treblinka. It was that people had never been there to look for that evidence, or if they had, that evidence, for example, from the Soviet investigations, had been marginalized. So I think archaeology offers the opportunity to present a more nuanced history of the Holocaust, and hopefully to bring back the humanity of those who suffered terribly in these places. So thank you very much for your attention. A little bit over, sorry.
Well, thank you, Caroline, for this very, very insightful lecture. We do have some time for questions and answers. Because we are recording this event, I have to ask you to please speak into a microphone. If you have a question, I will be running around, and Caroline can use this microphone.
Thank you.
It works.
Thanks very much. Excellent presentation. I have a question for you. I was in Treblinka in early July, and there are some, in Treblinka too, there are some excavations that are going on there that have been stopped because they said they found human remains there. And later, I was out looking at some Einsatzgruppen killing sites with a team from Yahad and Unum, and they said that they intentionally conceal some of these sites because they're worried about grave robbing. This must provide a unique challenge for you as a archaeologist in doing this work. Can you kind of speak to that?
Yes, of course, yeah. So, I mean, actually, the very foundation of my work, as I said, was my PhD actually focused on developing this methodology of non-invasive archaeology because of these ethical challenges. I often speak about this subject because I think it's incredibly important that as archaeologists that we're respectful to this history and that we don't continue to defile the victims by not carrying out our practice in a way that does respect the fact that Jewish remains are not supposed to be disturbed if they've been buried in a grave. I've always consulted with the rabbinical authorities about this very, very closely, but it does happen, of course. Like even when we excavated the gas chambers, for example, at Treblinka, and we were allowed to do that because we'd identified where the mass graves were at the extermination camp and we could avoid them, but we still came across scattered human remains. And so that was a case for us of consulting with the rabbinical authorities who advised that because they were scattered, they should be gathered and they should be reburied appropriately. But these sites, the murders were carried out on such a scale that the remains are essentially everywhere. So it is extremely difficult to be able to sort of rule out certain locations. And yeah, I mean, I wrote about this quite a lot, that essentially as an archaeologist, you're trying to do these searches so these sites can be marked and that people can go there to commemorate. But in doing so, you are alerting people who may want to loot them to where they might be. And I know for a long time Yahad had a policy of not actually divulging that information for that very reason. And sadly at Treblinka there is looting that goes on even now. So it is a big, big challenge.
This is very fascinating, and I particularly like how you're showing that your research really is overturning narratives that have been passed down to us. And I think a number of these narratives really come from the perpetrators themselves, who wanted, because there was such especially from, I know more about Treblinka too, but a dearth of survivors, we really, the story was told by the perpetrators and perpetrator documents and perpetrator testimony. One of the things that you mentioned about the execution site becoming a secondary killing site for Treblinka too, and in particular, when you tied this to the people, the corpses found that had clothing, this winter clothing, and it was interpreted that this was the winter of 42, 43, which is, Treblinka 2 is highly operational. And you mentioned especially the chaotic period, and perpetrator testimony holds that chaotic period was really July, August, September of 1942 under this first commandant, Aberl. And that then Franz Stangl, the second commandant, came. They paused the deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto during the Great Action, and he cleaned everything up and systematized everything. And then it was a camp that was a model camp, as it were. But I'm wondering if you have seen ways in which, like, especially at that execution site, that really disrupts this narrative of this chaotic, people jumping from the train or being bodies on the sides of the track in that 8-week period, and then suddenly we are into functioning, which really does sort of follow Stangl in that post-war period as the model commandant of a death camp.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I feel like I should give a preface to my answer to apologize for the fact that I didn't speak extensively about the extermination camp today, because I obviously have spoken quite extensively about the discoveries of the gas chambers and the kind of architecture of the extermination camp. And I think I really did want to kind of share some of that kind of evolution today. But I mean, I can also signpost people to some more of the information about the extermination camp findings. But absolutely, I mean, yeah, there was definitely that sense that once Stangl came along, that everything was cleaned up and everything was, very industrialized. But actually, that really wasn't what happened. I mean, just the practicalities of the number of people who were being sent there, and then these kind of conflicting ideas about, You know, should the bodies be buried in graves? Should they be cremated? And then, especially once the decision was taken to exhume the remains, the whole process of that was so time-consuming and difficult whilst they were still trying to receive transports, that actually it just became very chaotic. And they consistently in the extermination camp, for example, still had a shooting site that was active all the way through the camp's existence. And so and oftentimes they would still have to resort to shooting as a means of killing people, because they just didn't have that capacity to move as many people as they wanted to kill through the process. But they kept this air of, yes, everything is organized. Probably because Erbel was removed from his post and obviously, was in serious trouble with the authorities when he didn't do his job. So yeah, that happened very much. And again, that was reflected in the archaeological findings, because many of the remains that we did find when we excavated the gas chambers weren't cremated, for example, or were cremated only partially. And so even that narrative of all the remains were cremated from Treblinka is simply not true. But it's one that the perpetrators, of course, wanted to, sort of profess to their superiors. So yeah, lots of narratives to be disrupted and changed, I think.
Hi, thank you for coming. Appreciated your talk. About 15 years ago, I had a chance to tour the Mauthausen complex, and just the description of the area struck me that the comparisons between with the quarry and some of the other things, that both of the camps seemed kind of similar. And when I was at Mauthausen, I was always struck by how small a space it was. It struck me, it still surprises me. Can you give a kind of a scale of the space that we're talking about for the Treblinka area? Your maps, some of them look like they could be a larger area, but I just don't know, so I'm really curious in my comparisons between the two, Mauthausen was small, but what was Treblinka like?
Yeah, so the labour camp was about 17 hectares. I think the extermination camp was about 13 hectares, something like that. So, you're talking about a small space. And the extermination camp didn't need to be that big, because there was no permanent accommodation barracks for anybody other than some Jews who were kept alive to obviously help with the process. And that number of Jews was very small. So, again, the architecture of the camp very much reflected its purpose. And therefore, really, the main space that was needed was the unloading area from the trains, and then the burial locations. But again, if you kind of take like the two camps together, the space in between, the execution site, I know I'm mixing up my measurements here, but I know from when we did the LiDAR survey, for example, that was about 3.75 square miles of area, which encapsulated all of the terrain. Yeah, so very small. Yeah.
How far was the camp from the village? Was it such that you would expect people to hear, smell, see?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So actually, I should have said that Treblinka is actually named after a railway station that is actually quite a few miles away from the camp, and it's actually sort of between two other villages. So the people there gave a lot of testimony, particularly when the Soviets arrived, the Red Army, in August 1944. They were very quick to say, we could see this, we could smell this, we could hear it, and and they became very important witnesses in documenting what happened there. It's not quite like Majdanek, which if you've seen that, there were blocks of flats that were really like directly overlooking the camp, and the concealment provided by the forest prevented some visibility. But actually, if you're very interested in that subject, then there is an American scholar called Jacob Floors, who's actually written, he's just this week, in fact, I think, released a book called Spaces of Treblinka, and he wrote an article about the kind of sensory aspects, and it's something I write about as well, but he's got ahead of me and published a very, very good book, and he's doing a couple of book talks, which I know are online, and he has derived his research a lot from those people who lived in the vicinity.
Maybe one more question. I also want to encourage our students to participate if they'd like to. There's a question.
Thank you. You described an example where the guards would try to save on bullets before shooting people into the pit, but you said there was a survivor. Would you be permitted to share a bit more about his story?
Yeah, so actually there was a few survivors who actually did manage to survive the various executions that happened for different reasons. So yeah, Israel Simlich was in the camp for well, he was one of several inmates who were in the camp for many, many months. So he published a book, which was published by Yad Vashem, and he gives a very, very detailed account of his daily life. So he was a slightly more specialized worker, which is what allowed him to stay alive. And he actually drew one of the plans that I showed, and that plan's in the Yad Vashem. I redrew that, so it doesn't quite look like that, but it's he did a sketch of the camp. He lost almost all members of his family, and he basically stayed alive, as I said, by doing this kind of specialist work and being useful to the Germans. But he's one of the very few who actually wrote a more extended testimony of his time in the camp. And he was also a very important witness to what was going on at the extermination camp, because again, they could see, they could smell, they could hear what was going on near the camp. So I can send, maybe if I share with Annika, maybe the references to some important books, but his testimony is very important, and was co-published also with somebody who escaped from the extermination camp as well.
I know one narrative we hear a lot about Treblinka is that...
Sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
You were then for a minute.
I know one narrative we hear a lot about Treblinka is that Jews were sent there to die. They were sent on trains from Warsaw and immediately killed in the gas chambers. And obviously your work on this Treblinka 1 labor camp challenges that commonly kind of held belief. And I'm just wondering how the forced labor in Treblinka 1 interacted with that. Mm-hmm. How long were forced laborers kept there? Were they eventually taken to the extermination center in Treblinka 2 to be killed? And I'm just curious what the interplay between that theory is.
Yeah, so there's some really interesting examples that kind of show this interplay. So as I said at the beginning, it should have been that people who were given a sentence to be in the labor camp were there between 3 and 6 months, if you were not Jewish. If you were Jewish, it was potentially infinite. So there were people who were there for several years if they managed to survive. So some people were sent to the extermination camp to be killed. We do know that did happen, but as I said, by and large, they used the execution site as a killing place or the labor camp as a killing place instead. But often the labor camp, the people who ended up in the labor camp once the extermination camp was opened were actually selected from the transports. And I think historians are really reluctant to mention that because it's almost like if you admit that people had a chance of survival, again, it kind of derails this narrative that this was solely a killing facility. But actually, it wasn't regular like many of the other camps, like Auschwitz, for example. It wasn't on that kind of scale, but there were people who were selected when they arrived at Treblinka 2 and were sent to the labor camp. That did happen. And workers from the labor camp often had to pass the extermination camp. So there was even some interaction between the Jewish Sonderkommando who were kept alive in the extermination camp and labor camp Jews. And I had this really amazing testimony that I found where there was a labor camp group who were repairing the road, and they found out about the fact that extermination camp Sonderkommando were planning a revolt, and they were planning a revolt as well. And so they tried to connect. And it's this incredible story of how they basically tried to speak to them without making it clear that they were talking to each other. And eventually they managed to do this, and they told them about what they were experiencing in the labor camp. And the extermination camp Sonderkommando Jews, who, bear in mind, had experienced having to bury the bodies of the victims and had to live in this environment with the killings going on, they felt so horrified by what they saw that they actually gave their bread rations to the labor camp victims to try and help them sort of fortify themselves for a potential revolt. And I just thought that that was an incredible testimony that showed the, the selflessness of people in those situations. And so there was very much a plan that they were going to get, they were going to try and work together. And unfortunately, a revolt in the labor camp didn't happen. And that's how the 500 to 700 Jews who were in there in July 1944 ultimately ended up being murdered. Okay.
Thank you for sharing your work with us. You mentioned on one of the maps there were adjacent buildings that had been concealed. The foundations were present. One was for Jewish women that it housed. The other was hospital or sick.
Yeah, like a sick barrack.
And it was unknown why they were concealed, but I just wondered your thoughts about why those may have been concealed more so than, extermination chambers or something else.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, we know from testimonies like that this is what these buildings were used for. I mean, as I say, there are these accounts that if you ended up in one of these hospitals, that was where you were more likely to have been then taken and murdered. But I'm not entirely sure that anything about the architecture of that building set it apart from any of the other barracks that existed. And actually, when we looked at what the foundations looked like, they looked very similar. They're big blocks of concrete kind of put together to form these foundations. So I don't know why that took place, actually. But they didn't go to the same level of effort in the labor camp to hide the crimes. And again, I think that shows a confidence in this narrative that it was, it was just a labor camp. So that's why we still have foundations of that, of the buildings in that camp. And they did have to beat a fairly hasty retreat because the Red Army were coming, and then had to leave. So there were still standing wooden barracks at that point, many of which were then taken down by the local population afterwards. So that's why these Soviet accounts are really important as well, because they photograph the camp. And we know and this is a slight aside, but in the labor camp and the extermination camp, there were many more traces that actually did survive into 1944, and the Red Army documented a lot more evidence. But even a few months later, when the Polish authorities came along to investigate, many of those traces had been robbed out. So some of the damage potentially to the labor camp was also done in the process of these post-war looting activities as well.
All right, I want to thank Carolyn Sturdy-Colls again for a wonderful lecture and for extraordinary research. And I want to thank all of you for coming today, for great questions. And I also would like to invite you to a small reception just outside the lecture hall. And I wish you well for the next months. Thank you.
Thank you.